Associate Solicitor here at TLT. This is a bite-sized session where I'll be talking through the changes which the new Procurement Act 2023 is bringing into place in relation to dynamic markets and frameworks. I specialise in public procurement and public contracts, and like you, I imagine, getting ready for the new go-live date of the Procurement Act. So with that in mind, let's have a look at the agenda for today. Over the next 15 minutes or so, we'll be having a look at what is a framework, dynamic market, and open framework. What are the rules when tendering under a framework and dynamic market? And also having a look at the fees, barriers, and reporting obligations in relation to dynamic markets and frameworks. So let's first have a look at what a dynamic market actually is. So looking at the first 2 bullet points there, a dynamic market is a list of qualified suppliers. So for example, suppliers who have met the conditions for membership of the dynamic market, who are eligible to participate in future procurements, with suppliers only eligible to participate in the procurements for the parts or categories for which they have qualified. Now, dynamic markets have replaced dynamic purchasing systems under the previous legislation. There are key differences, and we'll highlight them in this slide. The headline ultimately, though, is that the benefit of dynamic markets is that if they are created well, it can provide contracting authorities with a fantastic window into the market and also cuts out that participation stage. And it can work both ways because it can make it a lot easier and more streamlined for suppliers to get access to potential buyers. It is a great shop window. So now let's have a look at some of the key features of dynamic markets, and in particular, some of the key changes from that the Procurement Act 2023 has brought about. So looking at the second box there, suppliers must be allowed to join the market at any time. Now, this represents a key difference compared with frameworks, and it is good, especially where the market is constantly growing. It might allow new and developing suppliers to benefit from the same opportunities which their old counterparts have enjoyed, which makes for a really competitive and dynamic process. Looking at that third box now, so dynamic markets can now cover all types of goods, services and works, not just common commodities. We'll see if this does open up the opportunities and whether or not more dynamic markets are created compared with dynamic purchasing systems. This will, of course, be dictated by the need of the market and contracting authorities. So we'll wait to see on that one. Looking now at the fact that the documents establishing or modifying a dynamic market are not classed as a public contract. So the Procurement Act 23 has really helpfully clarified this point for us. But there are still rules that apply to the creation of a dynamic market set out by the Procurement Act, which contracting authorities need to comply with. Having a look now at the fact that procurements under the market are to be conducted in line with the competitive flexible procedure. So this will be a procedure that suppliers and contracting authorities will become familiar with, and competitive flexible procedure will be used in order to take the procurement process under dynamic markets. So essentially for suppliers, if you want to put yourself forward for an opportunity under a dynamic market and ultimately win it, then you'll still need to submit a tender as if you're procuring and tendering for a single opportunity. Looking at the notice requirements now, so notices are required when awarding a contract under a dynamic market in line with the competitive flexible procedure. So suppliers should expect to see similar notices, so tender notice, contract award notice, etc. And just a point on standstill period, it is a voluntary opportunity for contracting authorities to utilise. It isn't mandated when procuring under dynamic markets, but suppliers should not be surprised to see contracting authorities using this standstill opportunity. And just to highlight the last 2 boxes on the slide there, so dynamic markets cannot be used for below threshold goods and services contracts, but they can be used for works contracts which are over the financial threshold set out on screen there. So now let's have a look at what our framework is under the Procurement Act 2023. Firstly, looking at the 2 bullet points on the screen there, looking at the definition, hopefully this will be a familiar concept to many because the setup for frameworks is very similar compared to the previous legislation. So a framework is a contract between one or more contracting authority or contracting authorities and one or more suppliers that provide for the future award of call-off contracts by a contracting authority to the supplier or suppliers. And in most cases, a framework will not commit a contracting authority to enter into a call-off contract, but it is possible that some do. So now let's have a look at some of the key features. And again, we're going to highlight some of the key changes that have been brought by the Procurement Act 2023. So looking there at the fact that frameworks can have one or multiple suppliers, but the suppliers that are on the framework are fixed for the duration. So unlike the flexibility provided by dynamic markets, the accessibility for suppliers throughout the term of the framework does not exist. So it's a lot more of a closed opportunity compared with dynamic markets. Just looking at the second line there, so a selection methodology for awarding of call-off contracts under a framework. We'll cover this in more detail later on, but it is a process that's set by the framework itself, a competitive selection procedure that contracting authorities will need to utilise and suppliers will need to respond to in order for a call-off contract to be made under a framework. Just to highlight, there is the implied right there to exclude excludable suppliers. So the Procurement Act 2023 has really neatly elaborated on this for contracting authorities and suppliers, so it's really clear to the market. Now let's have a look at the notice requirements. So the notices at the start, certainly, when a contracting authority is calling off under a framework, they don't necessarily need to comply with a tender notice, for example. But once the kind of call off procedure is reaching its final stages, there is a contract award notice required. And again, a standstill period may be used by a contracting authority, and again, suppliers shouldn't be surprised if contracting authorities in fact use this. And again, a contract details notice will be required when a contracting authority is calling off a contract under a framework. But just to note there that a below threshold notice is required for notifiable below threshold contracts. So now let's have a look at this new concept of open frameworks under the Procurement Act 2023. So an open framework is a scheme of successive frameworks awarded on substantially the same terms as one another. In most cases, an open framework will function in and has similar features to a standard framework, but there are some key differences which we'll highlight here. So let's have a look at some of the key differences and in fact some of the key changes open frameworks under the Procurement Act. So the maximum duration of open frameworks is 8 years. This is where the open framework has a multitude of suppliers. However, where there is only one supplier under the open framework, it is limited to 4 years. It must open and close at different intervals, and it must open and close at least once. So it must be reopened at least once during the period of 3 years from the award of the first framework under the scheme, and within a period of 5 years then beginning on the award of the second framework in the scheme. But there is no actual limit on the amount of times the open framework can be reopened during the duration of the open framework. Previous frameworks do expire on the award of new ones, and there are no limits to the number of suppliers who can access open frameworks. Now, suppliers included can change over the life of the framework, and this can be a benefit and a detriment for the market. So the flexible approach means that suppliers can join. So it might have been that a supplier couldn't meet the conditions for joining the open framework initially, or in fact, the supplier might not have existed when the first framework under the open framework was opened. So it gives that little bit more flexibility for suppliers. But certainly the detriment maybe for the open framework setup is that a supplier who would sit on a standard framework for the duration of the framework would maybe have a sense of security over its membership of that framework. That security is now a lot more up in the air, and certainly once the framework under an open framework is reopened, then that supplier will have to essentially meet the conditions once again to join the framework. We've set out there the kind of a diagram of the procedure of the opening and closing of this open framework mechanism. So showing again the procedure from the first framework there to the second framework, and the ability for new and existing suppliers to kind of apply to become part of that framework, and eventually leading towards the end of that framework as well. Just to note that a framework award criteria for appointing suppliers to the framework must remain substantially the same for each framework in the scheme. So certainly this will need a lot of foresight from both contracting authorities and suppliers at the start to make sure that everything is set up for the entire duration of the open framework. And it just remains to be seen whether or not this new flexible type of framework will be used much. And of course, it might be particularly helpful for new and emerging markets, but similar with dynamic markets, the use of it will be dictated, I'm sure, by the need of contracting authorities and the need of the market moving forward. So now let's have a look at other notable points of framework and dynamic markets. So for dynamic markets, there are new notice obligations for contracting authorities that the market and suppliers should expect to see. So there is the notice there that contracting authorities will need to publish, setting out its intention to create a dynamic market. And then the following ones there, so setting out once it's been established, if the contracting authority modifies the dynamic market, then they'll need to publish a notice to that effect. And also once the dynamic market ceases to operate, then the contracting authority will also need to notify the market on that point. And just to note that the three last notices there, there isn't necessarily set deadlines that contracting authorities have to comply with. It's just more as soon as possible for that contracting authority to actually publish. Now, for frameworks, when a contracting authority sets up a framework, because it is that public contract status, there is a requirement there to publish a tender notice and contract details notice, similar to if that contracting authority was doing an open or competitive flexible procedure. So that's, again, what suppliers should expect to see delivered out to the market when frameworks have been created. And just to highlight some specific carve-outs now for frameworks. So in relation to light touch contracts, the rules and direct award and competitive selection process do not apply. So there's a lot more flexibility there for light touch. And also the maximum term rules also do not apply. So if you are a supplier looking to get into a light touch framework, then do be aware that there's a lot more flexibility there and the rules might be slightly different as well. Now let's have a look at the rules when tendering under a framework or dynamic market, and starting with a framework. So contracting authorities and suppliers must comply with the competitive selection process. Now, the competitive selection process is set by the framework itself, rather than, let's say, a competitive tendering procedure like an open or competitive flexible procedure, where the rules will kind of be solely dictated by the Procurement Act 23 itself. So this is the mechanism which suppliers and contracting authorities must adhere to. Direct awards must be based on the framework pricing without adjustment. And just to note, so pricing under a competitive selection process is capped at the framework rates. So going back to the previous key features, when a supplier joins a framework, they'll have to provide their pricing and quality submissions at that point, which kind of then dictates how call-off works moving forward. A competitive selection process may include conditions of participation, and contracting authorities may also ask additional questions only by reference to one or more of the award criteria against which the framework tenders were assessed. Now, contracting authorities can set out to suppliers on the market at the point at which they're looking to take part in this competitive selection process, that they reserve the right to refine award criteria, but that needs to be really transparently and clearly set out at the initial stages, and that also applies for dynamic markets as well. Looking at dynamic markets, so procurements, as we've raised under dynamic markets, are done under the competitive flexible procedure. So the rules for that are dictated by the Procurement Act itself. The design of the procedure must be in line with the procurement document, so looking at the conditions of participation, for example. When a contracting authority wishes to award a contract under a dynamic market, a public notice must be published, and suppliers not already on the dynamic market must be provided with the opportunity to apply to join the dynamic market before the competition starts, unless there are exceptional circumstances, and that is set out by the Procurement Act. So again, this does offer a lot more flexibility to suppliers. The fact that regardless, an open notice will be sent out to the market when a contracting authority is looking to tender. And so that means that the fact that a supplier who might not have wanted to join a dynamic market previously, or actually you weren't aware of the existence of a dynamic market, will still be given notification of an opportunity, and therefore, because of the nature of dynamic markets, will be given that flexibility to join the dynamic market if they wish to proceed and put a tender in. And just to highlight as well, for dynamic markets, there is no scope for direct awards, so it's solely linked to awards under the competitive flexible procedure. So now let's have a look at the fees, barriers, and reporting obligations in relation to dynamic markets and frameworks. First of all, let's have a look at the fees. So this is one of the big changes brought by the Procurement Act 2023, that the owner of a dynamic market can now include fees as a fixed percentage that are to be paid by a supplier when a contract is awarded, and this is based on the estimated contract value. If a utilities contract, the fees can instead be based on membership, and contracting authorities can also charge fees in relation to suppliers obtaining and maintaining membership. And similar with frameworks, this is not necessarily a new setup, but the owner of framework can also charge fees. So certainly for suppliers, frameworks and dynamic markets can be a fantastic way into the market, but don't be surprised to see fees in place there in order to gain the benefit of being part of such a setup. Now, there is this overarching obligation to remove barriers for small to medium-sized enterprises, and this can be done by contracting authority by introducing lots of frameworks, and for dynamic markets by introducing categories or parts. So this can actually mean that whilst an SME might not be able to provide the whole services, which forms the banner of the dynamic or framework, or dynamic market or framework as relevant, but what they might actually be able to do is provide part of the service under that banner, and that's what lots and parts allows them to do, allows them to be competitive based on what they can actually offer. And finally, just having a look at the reporting obligations. So a framework owner will not need to establish KPIs for a framework. They apply instead to the call-off contracts awarded under the framework. But a framework owner will be required to publish a poor performance notice for a supplier who is not performing under the framework. The framework owner will need to publish a contract modification notice as well if they seek to rely on one of the modification grounds under the Procurement Act, if they're looking to modify the framework. And just to note that for dynamic markets, the various reporting arrangements linked with the contracts are linked with the contracts that are awarded under a dynamic market rather than to a supplier's membership of a dynamic market itself. Thanks for listening to this bite-sized session today. If you have any questions, do not hesitate to contact myself or any of my esteemed colleagues shown on slide here. Finally, just a quick plug for our Procuring 360 initiative, which is TLT's support package for both contracting authorities and public sector suppliers. This is in terms of getting ready for the new Procurement Act 2023. TLT are able to offer a wide range of support, not just legal, but also technical, consultancy, and more practical support. So do check out our website or contact a member of the team if you require any further support in relation to getting ready for the implementation of the plan. Thank you.